Letters to a Young Poet by Rainier Maria Rilke. Letter number 6. Rome, December 23rd, 1903. My dear Mr. Kappus, I don't want you to be without a greeting from me when Christmas comes, and when you, in the midst of the holiday, are bearing your solitude more heavily than usual. But when you notice that it is vast, you should be happy. For what, you should ask yourself, would a solitude be that was not vast? There is only one solitude, and it is vast, heavy, difficult to bear. And almost everyone has hours when he would gladly exchange it for any kind of sociability, however trivial or cheap, for the tiniest outward agreement with the first person who comes along, the most unworthy. But perhaps these are the very hours during which solitude grows, for its growing is painful as the growing of boys, and sad as the beginning of spring. But that must not confuse you. What is necessary, after all, is only this solitude, vast inner solitude, to walk inside yourself and meet no one for hours. That is what you must be able to attain. To be solitary as you were when you were a child, when the grown-ups walked around involved with matters that seemed large and important because they looked so busy, and because you didn't understand a thing about what they were doing. And when you realize that their activities are shabby, that their vocations are petrified and no longer connected with life, why not then look upon it all as a child would, as if you were looking at something unfamiliar out of the depths of your own world, from the vastness of your own solitude, which is itself work and status and vocation? Why should you want to give up a child's wise not understanding in exchange for defensiveness and scorn, since not understanding is, after all, a way of being alone, whereas defensiveness and scorn are a participation in precisely what, by these means, you want to separate yourself from? Think, dear sir, of the world that you carry inside you. Call this thinking whatever you want to, a remembering of your own childhood, or a yearning toward a future of your own. Only be attentive to what is arising within you, and place that above everything you perceive around you. What is happening in your innermost self is worthy of your entire love. Somehow, you must find a way to work at it, and not lose too much time or too much courage in clarifying your attitude toward people. Who says that you have any attitude at all? I know your profession is hard and full of things that contradict you, and I foresaw your lament and knew that it would come. Now that it has come, there is nothing I can say to reassure you. I can only suggest that perhaps all professions are like that, filled with demands, filled with hostility toward the individual, saturated, as it were, with the hatred of those who find themselves mute and sullen in an insipid duty. The situation you must live in now is not more heavily burdened with conventions, prejudices, and false ideas than all the other situations. And if there are some that pretend to offer a greater freedom, there is nevertheless none that is in itself vast and spacious and connected to the important things that the truest kind of life consists of. Only the individual who is solitary is placed under the deepest laws like a thing. And when he walks out into the rising dawn, or looks out into the event-filled evening, and when he feels what is happening there, all situations drop from him, as if from a dead man, though he stands in the midst of pure life. What you, dear Kappus, must have to experience as an officer, you would have felt in just the same way in any of the established professions, yes, even if outside any position you had simply tried to find some easy and independent contact with society. This feeling of being hemmed in would not have been spared you. It is like this everywhere, and that is no cause for anxiety or sadness. If there is nothing you can share with other people, try to be close to things, They will not abandon you. And the nights are still there, and the winds that move through the trees and across many lands. Everything in the world of things and animals is still filled with happening, which you can take part in. And children are still the way you were as a child, sad and happy in just the same way. And if you think of your childhood, you once again live among them, among the solitary children, and the grown-ups are nothing, and their dignity has no value. And if it frightens and torments you to think of childhood and of the simplicity and silence that accompanies it, because you can no longer believe in God, who appears in it everywhere, then ask yourself, dear Mr. Kappus, whether you have really lost God. Isn't it much truer to say that you have never yet possessed him? For when could that have been? Do you think a child can hold him? Him whom grown men bear only with great effort and whose weight crushes the old? Do you suppose that someone who really has him could lose him like a little stone? Or don't you think that someone who once had him could only be lost by him? But if you realize that he did not exist in your childhood and did not exist previously, if you suspect that Christ was deluded by his yearning and Muhammad deceived by his pride, and if you are terrified to feel that even now he does not exist, even at this moment when we are talking about him, what justifies you then, if he never existed, in missing him, like someone who has passed away, and in searching for him as though he were lost? Why don't you think of him as the one who is coming, who has been approaching from all eternity, the one who will someday arrive, the ultimate fruit of a tree whose leaves we are? What keeps you from projecting his birth into the ages that are coming into existence and living your life as a painful and lovely day in the history of a great pregnancy? Don't you see how everything that happens is again and again a beginning? And couldn't it be his beginning, since, in itself, starting is always so beautiful? If he is the most perfect one, must not what is less perfect precede him, so that he can choose himself out of fullness and superabundance? Must he not be the last one, so that he can include everything in himself? And what meaning would we have if he, whom we are longing for, has already existed? As bees gather honey, so we collect what is sweetest out of all things and build him, even with the trivial, with the insignificant. As long as it is done out of love, we begin with work and with the repose that comes afterward, with a silence or with a small solitary joy, with everything that we do alone without anyone to join or help us. We start him whom we will not live to see, just as our ancestors could not live to see us, and yet they, who passed away long ago, still exist in us, as predisposition, as burden upon our fate, as murmuring blood, and as gesture that rises up from the depths of time. Is there anything that can deprive you of the hope that in this way you will someday exist in him, who is the farthest, the outermost limit? Dear Mr. Kappus, celebrate Christmas in this devout feeling that perhaps he needs this very anguish of yours in order to begin. These very days of your transition are perhaps the time when everything in you is working at him, as you once worked at him in your childhood, breathlessly. Be patient and without bitterness, and realize that the least we can do is to make coming into existence no more difficult for him than the earth does for spring when it wants to come. And be glad and confident. Yours, Rainier Maria Rilke.